This book is off to a tremendous start, as well it should be. When Michelle first proposed this book to us a number of years ago, everyone at the editorial meeting where the proposal was discussed agreed that it was the single best proposal we had seen in at least a decade. Michelle is an awesome thinker. She is brilliant, and she is very exacting. She holds the bar incredibly high, which is probably why she produced 3 children in the time it took her to produce this book. I just had to say that. It's such a great fun fact. The first printing of the book has sold out. There are exactly 26 copies here, and there are more than 26 of you. I don't want to cause a stampede. But these are some of the few copies in New York, so get yours while you can. Mobile Libris is here selling tonight, and we're grateful to them for doing that. If we do run out, they have order forms, and you can order the book, and they will send it to you free shipping as soon as it comes back in. Michelle has been doing civil rights work for a very long time. I first came across her work when she was a Soros Justice Fellow at the Open Society Institute. She is now at Ohio State Law School, where she has a joint appointment with the pt1 Institute. Before that, she was at the ACLU of Northern California running the Racial Justice Initiative. She clerked for a Supreme Court Justice, if I have that right. Do I have that right? Yeah. So, you know, kind of a slouch, but what can you do? And with that, I give you Michelle Alexander.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the very warm and generous introductions. I want to thank Demos and the ACLU and the Metropolitan Black Bar Association. You know, it's just really an honor to be here. Well, let me acknowledge at the outset that the argument that I'm going to make tonight and that I make in my book is hard for a lot of folks to swallow, particularly if you yourself have never spent time in prison or have been labeled a felon. But here's the claim that I make in the book and spend nearly 300 pages proving with voluminous data, evidence, and testimony. Today, in the so-called era of color blindness, something akin to a racial caste system exists in America. This is not the cheerful, optimistic message you'll hear at most Black History Month gatherings that are still trumpeting the election of Barack Obama. But it is, I believe, the truth, a truth that we as a nation have gone to great lengths to deny, or perhaps it's more accurate to say to avoid knowing. For those of you who might be tempted to dismiss this type of claim out of hand, you know, I just encourage you to keep an open mind. I myself dismissed this claim more than a decade ago, a fact I now regret. As I discuss in the introduction to my book, I first encountered the idea of a new racial caste system more than a decade ago when a bright orange poster caught my eye. I was rushing to catch the bus in Oakland, and I saw this bright orange poster stapled to a telephone pole, and on it it said, "The drug war is the new Jim Crow." And I stopped for a minute and kind of scanned the text of the flyer, and I saw that, you know, a radical community group was holding a meeting in a local church just a few blocks away, and they were going to be organizing to protest the new 3 strikes law in California, the expansion of the prison system and police brutality. And I remember, you know, thinking to myself, yeah, you know, the criminal justice system is racist in a lot of ways, but it doesn't help to make such absurd comparisons. You know, people just think you're crazy. You know, and then I crossed the street and hopped on the bus on my way to my new job as director of the Racial Justice Project at the ACLU. Well, when I began my work at the ACLU, you know, I assumed that the criminal justice system had problems of racial bias, much in the same way, you know, all institutions in our society are infected with conscious and unconscious bias. You know, as a civil rights lawyer, I had worked on employment discrimination cases where, you know, racial stereotyping, racial bias permeates subjective decision-making at all levels of institutions, and I saw, the devastating consequences of institutional discrimination. So when I went to the ACLU, I shifted my focus from employment discrimination to criminal justice reform and kind of dedicated myself to the task of rooting out racial bias wherever and whenever it would rear its ugly head in the criminal justice system. But by the time I left the ACLU, I had come to believe that I was wrong about the criminal justice system. It was not just another institution infected with racial bias, but a different beast entirely. The activists who post the sign on the telephone pole were not crazy, nor were the smattering of lawyers and activists around the country that were beginning to connect the dots between mass incarceration and earlier forms of racial control. So quite belatedly, really, I came to see that mass incarceration in the United States has come to function as a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of social control analogous to Jim Crow. I state on page 2 of the introduction, what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, all the old forms of discrimination, housing discrimination, employment discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you scarcely have more rights and arguably less respect. Not sure.
You're being censored.
I guess so. It is a conspiracy. As a criminal, you scarcely have more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it. Well, here are some facts I uncovered in the course of my research for writing this book that you probably haven't heard on the evening news. More African Americans are under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. As of 2004, more black men were disenfranchised due to felon disenfranchisement laws than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race. In some major American cities, like Chicago, more than half of working-age African American men have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste. They are permanently locked into an inferior second-class status by law and custom, much like their grandparents or their great-grandparents may have been during Jim Crow. I find that when I tell people, that I think mass incarceration amounts to a new Jim Crow, I'm frequently met with, shocked disbelief. People say, what? How can you say that? Just look at Barack Obama, just look at Oprah Winfrey, But the fact that some African Americans have experienced great success in recent years does not mean that something akin to a racial caste system no longer exists. No caste system in the United States has ever governed all African Americans. There have always been free blacks and black success stories, even during slavery in Jim Crow. The superlative nature of individual black achievement today suggests that the old Jim Crow system is dead, but it doesn't necessarily mean the end of racial caste. You know, if history is any guide, it may have just taken a different form. You know, any candid observer of American history, I think, has to acknowledge that the rules and reasons the legal system employs for enforcing status relations of any kind, they evolve and they change as they're challenged. You know, in the first chapter of the book, I describe in some detail kind of the cyclical rebirths of racial caste in America. You know, African Americans have repeatedly been controlled through institutions like slavery and Jim Crow that appear to die, but then are reborn in new form tailored to the needs and constraints of the time. Jim Crow replaced slavery. Mass incarceration, I believe, has replaced Jim Crow. The emergence of this new system of control really has been just sudden and dramatic. In less than 30 years, the US penal population went from about 300,000 to more than 2 million, quintupled, right? The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, dwarfing the rates of even highly repressive regimes like China and Iran. In fact, if we as a nation were to return to the rate of incarceration that we had back in the 1970s, you know, a time, by the way, that many civil rights activists thought that rates of incarceration were just egregiously high. If we were going to return to the bad old days of the 1970s, we'd have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system could lose their jobs. That's how enormous and entrenched this new system has become in an incredibly short period of time. So what accounts for this, you know, unprecedented expansion of our criminal justice system? You know, crime rates? You know, that's a popular answer, but no, crime rates actually have remarkably little to do with skyrocketing incarceration rates. Crime rates have fluctuated over the past 30 years and today are actually at historical lows, but incarceration rates have consistently soared. You know, so what does explain this vast new system of control? Well, it turns out that the activists who posed the sign on the telephone pole were right. The war on drugs, the drug war, is the single most important cause of the expansion of the prison system in the United States. Drug convictions account for about 2/3 of the rise in the federal prison population and more than half of the increase in the state population. Drug convictions have increased by more than 1,000% since the drug war began. And for those who believe, you know, that the drug war has been principally concerned with kind of rooting out drug kingpins or violent offenders, well, you should think again. 4 out of 5 drug convictions are for possession, only 1 out of 5 for sales. Most people in state prison for drug offenses today have no, I repeat, no history of violence or significant selling activity. In fact, in the 1990s, the period of the most dramatic expansion of the drug war, marijuana possession convictions accounted for nearly 80% of the increase. Marijuana possession, marijuana, a drug less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, and marijuana possession is a crime that is most certainly committed as much by whites, middle-class whites, as it is by poor African Americans. But the drug war has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color. Studies have consistently shown now for decades that people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites. Now that defies kind of our usual thinking about who a drug dealer is. We think typically of, you know, a black kid standing on a street corner with his pants sagging down. Well, plenty of drug dealing happens in the ghetto, but it happens everywhere else in America as well. The drug market in America is highly segregated by race, much like our society is. Blacks tend to sell to whites, whites tend to sell to each other, Latinos tend to sell to each other, university students sell to each other. Drug dealing happens everywhere in America. In fact, most Americans violate drug laws at some point in their lifetime. But relatively few white people ever do time for drug offenses. Those who do time for drug crime in the United States are overwhelmingly black and brown. In fact, in some states, African Americans alone have accounted for 80 to 90% of all drug convictions.